The Story of the First Dutch War, by Alfred H Miles. B.Y. John Campbell. The causes of this war are differently stated, according to the humours and opinions of different writers. The Parliament, on the one side, was jealous of its newly acquired sovereignty, and expected extraordinary marks of deference from the powers with which it corresponded. The Dutch, on the other hand, were extremely alarmed when they found the English Commonwealth insisting upon the sovereignty of the sea, the right of fishing, and of licensing to fish, and disposed to carry the point of saluting by the flag to the utmost limit. Under these conditions of excitement and tension, anxiety led to watchfulness and proximity to rupture. It was in the spring of the year 1652 that the war broke out, but it was warmly disputed then, and has not been fully settled since, who were the actual aggressors. It is clear, however, that the Dutch had secretly made great preparations for war, and had actually 150 ships of force at sea, whereas the English Parliament had equipped no more than the usual squadron for guarding the narrow seas, which was a fleet of 25 ships under the command of Admiral Blake. The first blood drawn in this quarrel was occasioned by Commodore Young, who fired upon a Dutch man-of-war upon the captains, refusing him the honour of the flag. This was on May 14, 1652, and would have attracted much more public attention if an engagement of greater consequence had not happened immediately after. Admiral Van Tromp was at sea with a fleet of upwards of 40 sail, to protect, as was given out, the Dutch trade. This fleet, coming into the Downs on May the 18th, met with a small squadron under the command of Major Bourne, to whom the Admiral sent word that he was forced in by stress of weather. Bourne answered roundly that the truth of this would best appear by the shortness of his stay, and immediately sent advice of it to his Admiral. The next day Van Tromp with his fleet bore down upon Blake in Dover Road, and on his coming near him, Blake fired thrice at his flag, upon which the Dutch Admiral returned a broadside. For nearly 4 hours Blake was engaged almost alone with the Dutch squadron, but by degrees the weather permitted his fleet to come in to his assistance. Towards the close of the engagement, which lasted from 4 in the afternoon till 9 at night, Bourne joined him with his 8 ships, upon which the enemy bore away. In this battle the victory was clearly on the side of the English, as the Dutch writers themselves confess, there being 2 Dutch ships taken and 1 disabled, whereas the English lost none, and yet the forces were very unequal, for the Dutch fleet consisted of 42 ships and Blake's at first only of 15, and even at the end of the fight of no more than 23. Each of the admirals wrote an account of this affair to their respective masters, wherein they plainly contradict each other, but with this difference, that there is no disproving any one fact mentioned in Blake's letter, whereas there are several inaccuracies in that of Van Tromp. The states themselves were so sensible of being in the wrong, and at the same time so mortified that their fleet, notwithstanding its superiority, had been beaten, that they apologized for it, and sent over another ambassador, Adrian Pau, to proceed with the treaty. But the demands of the Parliament were, in their opinion, too high, so all thoughts of peace were dismissed on both sides, and war was proclaimed in Holland on July 8. The English, in the meantime, in virtue of the Act of Navigation, and by way of reprisal for the late damages, affronts, and hostilities received from the States General and their subjects, took many Dutch ships. On June 11 Blake brought in 11 merchant ships with their convoy coming from Nantes. On June 12 Captains Taylor and Peacock in 2 English frigates engaged 2 Dutch men-of-war on the coast of Flanders for refusing to strike, one of which was taken and the other stranded, and on the 13th of the same month Blake took 26 merchant ships with their convoys homeward, bound from France. On July 4 Vice Admiral Ayscue, who on his late return from the reduction of Barbados had taken 10 merchant ships and 4 men-of-war, attacked the St. Ubé's fleet of about 40 sail, of which nearly 30 were taken, burnt or stranded, and plundered on the French coast. After this, while the States with the utmost diligence were getting ready a fleet of 70 men-of-war, under the command of Admiral Van Tromp, Blake, with about 60, received orders to sail to the north to disturb and distress the Dutch fishery. Sir George Ayscue, who, since the destruction of the St. Ubé's fleet, had taken 5 Dutch merchant ships, was left with the remainder of the English fleet, consisting of no more than 7 men-of-war in the Downs. While Blake triumphed in the north, Tromp with his great fleet came into the mouth of the Thames, in the hope of either surprising Ayscue or of insulting the coast. Failing in this, he sailed northward to intercept Blake, but his ships being dispersed by a storm, he was disappointed in that scheme also, and lost 5 or 6 frigates, which fell into the hands of Blake on his return towards the south. the people of Holland were very much dissatisfied with the conduct of Admiral Van Tromp, who, first justifying himself to the States, laid down his commission to gratify the people. The main objection against him was his being no great seaman, and this engaged the States to cast their eyes upon de Ruyter, the ablest man among them in his profession. He accepted the command, but accepted it unwillingly, for he saw that as things then stood the English were superior. The Parliament, in the meantime, took care to strengthen Sir George Ayscu's fleet, so that it increased to 38 sail, of which only 2 were large ships and the rest frigates and fireships. With these he put to sea in search of the Dutch, took many rich prizes, and at last met with de Ruyter, who, with a fleet equal to his own, was convoying home between 50 and 60 merchantmen. This was on August 16, 1652, and as our admiral was cruising off Plymouth. It was about 1 in the afternoon when the fleets came in sight. De Ruyter took 20 of the merchant ships into his line of battle, and was then very ready to engage. The fight began about 4, when the English admiral with 9 others charged through the Dutch fleet, and having thus gained the weather gauge, attacked them again and continued fighting till night parted them, the rest of Sir George's fleet having very little to do in the action. The rear admiral, Peck, lost his leg, and soon afterwards died, and most of the captains who did their duty were wounded. 1 fireship was lost. On the other side the Dutch were miserably torn, so that many of their best ships were scarcely able to keep the sea. Sir George Ayscue followed them for some time the next day, and then returned into Plymouth Sound to refresh his men and to repair his ships. Admiral Blake, who was now in the Channel, did infinite damage to the enemy, and some hostilities having been committed upon the coast of Newfoundland by the French, he attacked a strong squadron of their ships going to the relief of Dunkirk, and took or destroyed them all, by which means this important place fell into the hands of the Spaniards. The Dutch, seeing their trade thus ruined, and apprehensive of still worse consequences, fitted out another fleet under the command of De Witt, and sent it to join de Ruyter, who was appointed to bring home a large number of merchantmen. After the junction of these fleets, and the sending of their convoy into Holland, the admirals showed a design of attacking the English navy, and Blake gave them a fair opportunity of executing their intention. But when it came to the point, the Dutch fleet covered themselves behind a sandbank to avoid action. Blake, however, engaged them on September the 28th, dividing his fleet into 3 squadrons, the first commanded by himself, the second by Vice Admiral Penn, and the third by Rear Admiral Bourne. It was about 3 when the engagement began, and the English quickly discovered their rashness in attacking an enemy under such disadvantages, for the Sovereign, a new ship, struck immediately on the sands, and so did several others. But getting off again, the English fleet stood aloof till De Witt came freely from his advantages to a fair engagement, which was boldly begun by Bourne and gallantly seconded by the rest of the fleet. A Dutch man-of-war, attempting to board the Sovereign, was sunk by her side, and this by the first discharge she made. Soon after, a Dutch rear admiral was taken by Captain Mildmay, and 2 other men-of-war sunk, a third blowing up before the end of the fight. De Witt was then glad to retire, and was pursued by the English fleet as long as it was light. The next day they continued the chase till they were within 12 leagues of the Dutch shore, and then, seeing the Dutch fleet entering into the Goree, Blake returned in triumph to the Downs, and thence into port, having lost about 300 men, and having as many wounded. For the reception of the wounded, the Parliament took care to provide hospitals near Dover and Deal, and on the return of the fleet sent their thanks to the Admiral and his officers. It being now the beginning of November, Blake, who thought the season of action over, detached 20 of his ships for the security of the Newcastle colliers. 12 more were sent to Plymouth, and 15 had retired into the river, in order to repair the damage which they had received in a storm. Admiral Tromp, who had again taken command, having intelligence of this, and that Blake had with him no more than 37 ships, and many of these but thinly manned, resolved to attack him in the Downs, not far from the place where they had fought before. On November the 29th, he presented himself before the English fleet, and Blake, after holding a council of war, resolved to engage notwithstanding the great superiority of the enemy. But the wind rising, they were obliged to defer fighting until the next day, and that night our fleet rode a little above Dover Road. In the morning both fleets plied westward, Blake having the weather gauge. About 11 the battle began with great fury, but very unluckily for the English, half of their small fleet could not engage. The triumph in which Blake was in person, the Victory and the Vanguard bore almost the whole stress of the fight, having 20 Dutch men of war upon them at once, and yet they fought it out till it was dark. Late in the evening, the Garland, commanded by Captain Batten, and the Bonaventure, Captain Hookston, clapped Von Tromp aboard, killed his secretary and purser by his side, and would certainly have taken his ship if they had not been boarded by 2 Dutch flagships, by whom, after their captains were killed, both these ships were taken. Blake, who saw this with indignation, pushed so far to their relief that he was very near sharing the same fate, if the Vanguard and Sapphire had not stood by him with the utmost resolution and at last brought him off. The Hercules was run ashore in the retreat, and if the night had not sheltered them, most of the ships that were engaged must have been lost. But they took the advantage of its obscurity, and retired first to Dover, and then into the river. Admiral Tromp continued a day or two in the Downs, sailed from thence towards Calais, took part of the Barbados fleet and some other prizes, and then sailed to the Isle of Ré with a broom at his topmast head, intimating that he would sweep the narrow seas of English ships. There appears, however, no such reason for boasting as the Dutch writers suggest. Their fleet had indeed many advantages, yet they bought their success very dear, one of their best ships being blown up and 2 disabled. The Parliament showed their steadiness by caressing Blake after his defeat, and naming him, in conjunction with Deane and Monk, their generals at sea for another year. In order to the more speedy manning the navy, they issued a proclamation, offering considerable rewards to such as entered themselves within the term of 40 days. They also raised the sailors' pay from 19 to 24 shillings a month, and this had so good an effect that in 6 weeks' time they had a fleet of 60 men of war ready to put to sea, 40 under Blake in the river, and 20 more at Portsmouth. On February 11th both fleets joined near Beachy Head, and thence Admiral Blake sailed over against Portland, where he lay across the Channel, in order to welcome Tromp on his return. This was a surprise to the Dutch admiral, who did not think it possible after the late defeat for the Parliament to fit out in so short a period a fleet capable of facing him again. He had between 200 and 300 merchant ships under convoy, and was therefore much amazed when, sailing up the Channel, he found Blake so stationed that it was impossible to avoid fighting. English and Dutch authors vary pretty much as to the strength of their respective fleets, but on comparing the admiral's letters, they appear to have been nearly equal, each having about 70 sail. The generals Blake and Deane were both on board the Triumph, and with 12 stout ships led their fleet, and fell in first with the Dutch on February the 18th, 1653, about 8 in the morning. They were roughly treated before the rest of the fleet came up, though gallantly seconded by Lawson in the Fairfax, and Captain Mildmay in the Vanguard. In the Triumph Blake was wounded in the thigh by a piece of iron which a shot had driven, the same piece of iron tearing General Deane's coat and breeches. Captain Ball, who commanded the ship, was shot dead and fell at Blake's feet. His secretary, Mr. Sparrow, was likewise killed while receiving his orders, besides whom he lost 100 seamen, the rest being most of them wounded, and the ship so miserably shattered that it had little share in the next 2 days' fights. In the Fairfax there were 100 men killed, the ship being wretchedly mauled. The Vanguard lost her captain and a large number of men. The Prosperous, a ship of 44 guns, was boarded by de Ruyter and taken, but de Ruyter's ship being at that instant boarded by an English man-of-war, Captain Vesey in the Merlin frigate, entered the Prosperous and retook her. The Assistance, Vice-Admiral of the Blue Squadron, was disabled in the beginning of the fight and brought off to Portsmouth, whither the Advice quickly followed her, being no longer able to keep the sea. Tromp, who was long engaged with Blake, lost most of his officers and had his ship disabled. De Ruyter lost his main and foretopmast, and very narrowly escaped being taken. 1 Dutch man-of-war was blown up, 6 more were either sunk or taken. Friday night was spent in repairing the damage and making the necessary dispositions for a second engagement. On Saturday morning, the enemy was seen again 7 leagues off Weymouth, whither the English plied, and came up with them in the afternoon, about 3 leagues to the northwest of the Isle of Wight. Tromp had again drawn his fleet together, and ranged it in the form of a half-moon, enclosing the merchant ships within a semicircle, and in that posture he maintained a retreating fight. The English made several desperate attacks, striving to break through to the merchant ships, during which de Ruyter's ship was again so roughly treated that she was towed out of the fleet. At last the merchantmen, finding they could be no longer protected, began to shift for themselves, throwing part of their goods overboard for the greater expedition. According to Blake's own letter, 8 men of war and 14 or 16 merchant ships were taken, and the fight continued all night. On Sunday morning the Dutch were near Boulogne, where the fight was renewed, but with little effect. Tromp had slipped away in the dark with his merchantmen to Calais Sands, where he anchored that day with 40 sail. The wind favouring him, He thence tided it home, our fleet pursuing but slowly. For Blake, though he feared not Dutchmen, yet dreaded their shallow coasts. However, the captains Lawson, Martin, and Graver took each a Dutch man-o'-war, and Penn picked up many of their merchantmen. On the whole, the Dutch had the better of the fight the first day, lost ground the second, and were clearly beaten the third. They lost 11 men of war, their own accounts say but 9, 30 merchantmen, 1,500 men killed and as many wounded. As for the English, they lost only the Sampson, which Captain Batten, finding disabled, sank of his own accord, though it is certain our loss in killed and wounded was little inferior to that of the Dutch. Van Tromp now convoyed a great fleet of merchantmen by the north, trying that route to escape the difficulties of the Channel. Whereupon our navy followed him to Aberdeen, yet to no purpose, for he escaped them both going and coming back, which gave him an opportunity of coming into the Downs, making some prizes, and battering Dover Castle. This scene of triumph lasted but a week, for on May 31st Tromp had intelligence that Monk and Deane, who commanded the English fleet, were approaching, and that their whole fleet consisted of 95 sail of men of war and 5 fireships. The Dutch had 98 men of war and 6 fireships, and both fleets were commanded by men the most remarkable for courage and conduct in either nation, so that it was generally conceived this battle would prove decisive. On June 2nd in the morning, the English fleet discovered the enemy, whom they immediately attacked with great vigour. The action began about 11 o'clock, and the first broadside from the enemy carried off the brave Admiral Deane, whose body was almost cut in two by a chain shot. Monk, with much presence of mind, covered his body with his cloak, and here appeared the wisdom of having both admirals on board the same ship, for as no flag was taken in the fleet had no notice of the accident, and the fight continued with the same warmth as if it had not happened. The Blue Squadron charged through the enemy, and Rear Admiral Lawson bid fair for taking de Ruyter, and after he was obliged to leave his ship, sank another of 42 guns commanded by Captain Buller. The fight continued very hot till 3 o'clock, when the Dutch fell into great confusion, and Tromp saw himself obliged to make a kind of running fight till 9 in the evening, when a stout ship, commanded by Cornelius van Velsen, blew up. This increased the consternation in which they were before, and though Tromp used every method in his power to oblige the officers to do their duty, and even fired upon such ships as drew out of the line, yet it was to no purpose, but rather served to increase their misfortune. In the night Blake arrived in the English fleet with a squadron of 18 ships, and so had his share in the second day's engagement. Tromp did all that was consistent with his honour to avoid fighting the next day, but he would not do more, so that the English fleet came up with him again by 8 in the morning, and engaged with the utmost fury. The battle continued very hot for about 4 hours, and Vice-Admiral Penn boarded Tromp twice and had taken him if he had not been seasonably relieved by de Witt and de Ruyter. At last the Dutch fell again into confusion, which was so great that a plain flight quickly followed, and instead of trusting to their arms, they sought shelter on the flat coast of Newport, from whence with difficulty enough they escaped to Zealand. Our writers agree that the Dutch had 6 of their best ships sunk, 2 blown up and 11 taken. 6 of their principal captains were made prisoners, and upwards of 1,500 men. Among the ships before mentioned, 1 was a vice-admiral and 2 were rear-admirals. The Dutch historians, indeed, confess the loss of but 8 men of war. On our side, Admiral Deane and 1 captain were all the persons of note killed. Of private men there were but few, and not a ship was missing, so that a more signal victory could scarcely have been obtained, or, indeed, desired. After this victory, the Dutch sent ambassadors to England to negotiate a peace almost on any terms. The States were, however, far from trusting entirely to negotiations, but at the time they treated, laboured with the utmost diligence to repair their past losses and to fit out a new fleet. This was a very difficult task, and in order to effect it they were forced to raise the seamen's wages, though their trade was at a full stop. They came down in person to their ports, and saw their men embarked, and advanced them wages beforehand, and promised them if they would fight once more they would never ask them to fight again. Yet all this would hardly have sufficed if the industry of de Witt, in equipping their new-built ships, and the care and skill of Van Tromp in refitting their old ones, and encouraging the seamen, had not succeeded in equipping a fresh fleet of upwards of 90 ships by the latter end of July, a thing admired then, and scarcely credible now. These were victualled for 5 months, and the scheme laid down by the States was to force the English fleet to leave their ports by coming to block up ours. But first it was resolved Van Tromp should sail to the mouth of the Texel, where de Ruyter, with 25 sail of stout ships, was kept in by the English fleet, in order to try if they might not be provoked to leave their station, and thereby give the Dutch squadron an opportunity of coming out. On July 29, 1653, the Dutch fleet appeared in sight of the English, upon which the latter did their utmost to engage them. But Van Tromp, having in view the release of De Witt rather than fighting, kept off, so that it was 7 at night before General Monk in the Resolution, with about 30 ships, great and small, came up with him and charged through his fleet. It growing dark soon after, nothing more passed that night, Monk sailing to the south and Van Tromp to the northward, by which, unsuspected by the English, he both joined De Witt's squadron and gained the weather gauge. The next day proving very foul and windy, the sea ran so high that it was impossible for the fleets to engage, the English particularly finding it hard enough to avoid running upon the enemy's coasts. On Sunday, July 31st, the weather having become favourable, both fleets engaged with terrible fury. The battle lasted at least 8 hours, and was the most hard-fought fight of any that happened during the war, the Dutch fireships being managed with great dexterity. Many of the large vessels in the English fleet were in the utmost danger of perishing by them, and the Triumph was so effectually fired that most of her crew threw themselves into the sea. And yet the few who stayed behind succeeded in extinguishing the flames. Lawson engaged De Ruyter briskly, killed and wounded more than half his men, and so disabled his ship that it was towed out of the fleet, whereupon the admiral, returning in a galliot, went on board another ship. About noon, Van Tromp was shot through the body with a musket ball, as he was giving orders. This effectually discouraged his countrymen, so that by 2 they began to retreat in great confusion, having but one flag standing among them. The lightest frigates in the English fleet pursued them closely, till the Dutch admiral, perceiving they were but small and of no great strength, turned his helm and resolved to engage them. But some larger ships coming to their assistance, the Dutchman was taken. It was night by the time their scattered fleet reached the Texel, while the English, fearing their flats, rowed warily about 6 leagues off. This was a terrible blow to the Dutch, who, according to Monk's letter, lost no less than 30 ships. But from better intelligence it appeared that 4 of these had escaped, 2 into a port of Zealand, and 2 into Hamburg. Their loss, however, was very great. 5 captains were taken prisoners, between 4,000 and 5,000 men killed, and 26 ships of war either burnt or sunk. On the side of the English there were 2 ships only, viz., the Oak and the Hunter frigate burnt, 6 captains killed and upwards of 500 seamen. There were also 6 captains wounded, and about 800 private men. The Parliament then sitting ordered gold chains to be sent to the Generals Blake and Monk, and likewise to Vice-Admiral Penn and Rear-Admiral Lawson. They sent also chains to the rest of the flag officers, and medals to the captains. August 25th was appointed for a day of solemn thanksgiving, and General Monk being then in town, Cromwell, at a great feast in the city, put the gold chain about his neck, and obliged him to wear it all dinner time. As for the States, they supported their loss with inexpressible courage and constancy, and buried Tromp with great magnificence at the public expense. Hostilities between the 2 states had not continued quite 2 years, and yet in that time the English took no less than 1,700 prizes, valued by the Dutch themselves at 62 millions of guilders, or nearly 6 millions sterling. On the contrary, those taken by the Dutch did not amount to a 4th part either in number or value. Within that period the English were victorious in no less than 5 general battles, some of which were of several days' duration, whereas the Hollanders cannot justly boast of having gained one, for the action between De Ruyter and Ayscue, in which they pretended some advantage, was no general fight, and the advantage gained by Tromp in the Downs is owned to have been gained over a part only of the English fleet. Short as this quarrel was, it brought the Dutch to greater extremities than their 80 years of war with Spain.